שוב שלום לכם. אנא תפסו את מקומותיכם האחרונים בבקשה. So we can start the third part of this challenging and promising day. I would like to rely on some of Stephen's definition and humorous comment in his speech, because I'm not only a liberal, because I'm a Marxist, then I'm quite proud of saying my tenets of belief or my faith. And for me, this event of this day is so important, not because of the gatherings, the friendly gatherings that we are sharing together this morning, reflecting and meditating and thinking about such crucial topics. But I think that the voice of psychoanalysis in these days is lacking. It's too meager, it's too low, it's too weak. And I think that we have to do something to remedy this lack. And for me, this morning is kind of a remedy for this. And within the voice of psychoanalysis concerning relating to all kind of humane issues, the major role or the crucial role that self-psychology has, to my mind, concerns topics that in some way spontaneously and naturally and organically raised in both of the lectures that we have heard, the idea and the concept of empathy. And as you heard, empathy has many definitions and many kind of point of views that people adhere to. I think that the Israeli project of self-psychology is quite peculiar in positing empathy in somewhat a different place. If you remember, in his last paper that his son had to read before the Chicago Society and Institute, a semicircle of the mental health, revisiting of his 1959 paper, somewhere in the last paragraph or the two last paragraph of the article, Kohut says that unfortunately, I have to admit that empathy itself is curing. During all of his writings, he struggled with the problem whether empathy is only a mode of observation, a conceptual methodology, or a healing channel, a healing domain. And he tried throughout his writings to differentiate between the self-objecting functioning, which is for the benefit of the self, of the self in the metrics of the self-object self, from empathy itself. Empathy itself, as we heard, and I know that Thomas too is identifying with what Stephen thought that was displayed here about empathy. Empathy itself is somehow neutral. In this sense, Stephen could even say that justice is the way, this is the tool that we have to apply and to cultivate in order to diminish barriers and borders and boundaries between us and our others. The Israeli self-psychology community is quite well embedded with the Levinasian methodology and philosophy, and for us, justice is less high than empathy. Empathy itself is ingrained in our sense as an ethical concept. It's not a methodology, and not only a concept, epistemological concept, but the heart, the core of ethics. In this sense, there is, of course, so many ways to abuse empathy, and just recently a book quite eloquent, phrased and presented in the United States against empathy. And it's the same vein that feels the danger of abusing empathy in order to undermine the notion of empathy. In the sense that Stephen and Thomas in both lectures so beautifully displayed it, that we can manipulate, we can structure, we can make empathy as a notion of grandiosity, the notion of ethnocentricity, which is on the contrary. The major issue of empathy is all the opposite. What we can do with us, with ourselves, to diminish the boundaries between us and the others, this means for us empathy and not inflated ego as the group of the German in the Third Reich period or other phenomena of grouping that are made and created for the purpose of aggrandizing the inflated ego, the inflated grandiose archaic self, and not in order to transform the mind, the collective mind of the group, in order to emphasize those who are not included in the group. I would like to take into my side some of the lines that David Grossman just 3 days ago said in Mount Scopus in a speech that he made for getting the doctorate, honored doctorate from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And he said about writing, about the process of writing, and he almost, in a sense, cites from Kohutian legacy to my mind. He said in a very free translation, who writes in his life several protagonists and dissolved into them, and then came back to his selfhood. He who came from this protagonist into his selfhood, but knows that his selfhood is already made of this protagonist, this is someone who knows something about infinity. And to my understanding, empathy is a philosophical, intellectual, and mostly ethical concept that deals with infinity, with this ability of the human being to transcend his own grandiosity, his own grouping, whether the grouping is myself, or the grouping is this room, or the grouping is this nation, and so on. So in this sense, I think that I would like to pose a third or a second and a half position in this morning, and would like to raise this idea before Thomas and before Stephen, and we would like to have a conversation among all of us. So please, Thomas.
Okay, so I'll start. People sometimes will ask me, are you a Kohutian? And I never know what to say about this. I say, no, probably not, I'm a Kohut. And, you know, honestly, I couldn't tell you in the lecture just how self-psychological that talk was. I think I could have translated it in, you know, traumatic de-idealization and all kinds of things, but I didn't. And so what bothers me a little bit is that the aspect of my father's thought that I've in recent times been focusing most on, and that is probably the biggest, my current intellectual project, is unfortunately empathy. And the problem with empathy is it is such a squishy, ill-defined, multi-defined, capacious concept even my father's writings on empathy are not, in my view, all that rigorous. I think he made the claim that it is introspection and empathy that defines psychoanalysis as a discipline. There are real problems with that statement because there's a lot of extrospection that goes on in psychoanalysis as well. But there's also something profoundly right about that statement. But it's just, he needed to spend a lot more time thinking empathy through. And I've been, in the last couple of years, trying to think empathy through, particularly as it relates to history. And I guess sort of the nice thing, or the kind of non-controversial thing we can all say about empathy is that it has many definitions, and everyone who uses empathy as a concept just needs to be explicit about what empathy means to them. And empathy for me, as it does for Stephen Aschheim, empathy for me is a way of knowing, primarily. It's the ability to think your way, perhaps to feel your way, certainly to imagine your way inside the experience of another person. That's my definition of empathy. That is definitely not sympathy. That is also, it's very important. I mean, empathy can be defined as affective sharing, as merger, as identification, as contagion, all different kinds, as sympathy or as the basis of a pro-social attitude. All of these definitions are there, but those aren't my definition. My definition is putting oneself in the place of the other and looking, or trying to look, using one's imagination to try to look at the world from the other person's point of view. Recognizing all along that that's not really fully possible, but that there is a profound difference between trying to do that and not trying to do that. So I was very, I think one last thing, I think there's one maybe interesting difference between being a therapist and being a historian, that the curative aspect of empathy is clearly going to be more important for a therapist than it would be for a historian. I'm not interested in curing Nazis, but I am interested in trying to understand them. And I think I did, or I tried at least, in the paper that you heard today, I was trying to empathize with those interviewees. I was giving you an interpretation about why they tried to close off empathy for Jews. So in my work, I am not empathizing with people I like. I don't like those people. And I think it's very possible, and in fact an imperative, this I'm quoting, my father said the exact same thing, that it's an imperative, in fact, to try to understand people who are maybe not sympathetic to you. You empathize when you are confronted with something that doesn't make sense from your perspective. It's a kind of, when you're presented with an explanatory puzzle, it is then that to solve that puzzle you try to think your way, or imagine your way, or maybe even occasionally feel your way into that other person's point of view. That is not to say, in therapy, that understanding isn't curative, because being empathized with is a wonderful feeling. But it bothers me sometimes listening to self-psychologists. You know, every time something bad happens in a family, it's that the parents weren't empathic. And every interpretation that didn't seem to work that well is an unempathic interpretation. Everything good becomes empathic and everything bad becomes unempathic. That just is too, again, vague and capacious. And I think parents can oftentimes, and in relationships, we can be very unempathic, or we can be very empathic and hurtful. I think we all know that. You say something to someone because you know it's really going to hurt their feelings. And certainly, I think empathy can be and is very frequently used to harm other people. I think the example of Iago and Othello is excellent. So I think there is maybe a difference there between therapy and history. The one thing I agreed was terrible, because I think Stephen wanted, I don't know if he really wanted to be booed. Maybe he was trying to avoid being booed, I don't know. But he seemed to want to be booed, and I was like ready to want to boo him, but I agreed with everything he said. So that was a problem. But the one thing, and this I can say maybe as an American and not as an Israeli, because it is a little awkward to comment on Israel's politics as someone who doesn't live here. But I think the one thing I didn't agree with that Stephen said is that empathy, you said, Stephen, that empathy is with oneself or people close to you is the easiest. And I think actually empathy with oneself and with people very close to one is actually hard. First of all, you may not recognize difference because you tend to sort of assume that the other person is like you. And I think, in my experience as a therapist, which is very brief and long ago, I think what one tries to do as a therapist, and it's really hard to do, is have the patient or the client learn to empathize with themselves. Instead of beating themselves up for feelings that seem terrible and inappropriate and outrageous, you get them to understand why it makes sense, given who they are and what their lives were like, that it makes sense that they feel what they feel and think what they think and do what they do, and they become less critical and more empathic with themselves. And I think developing empathy with the self is one of the projects, one of the therapeutic projects. So the one thing my one comment in relation to Stephen's talk, which I wanted to make, is that I think not only, as Stephen said, is it important for Israeli Jews to empathize with Palestinians, but I think it's really important for Israeli Jews to empathize with Israeli Jews and try to understand why it's hard to empathize, perhaps, with Palestinians. That one needs to that one needs to explore oneself, and that may be the project of understanding oneself and empathizing with oneself is a really, really difficult thing to do, and to try to understand why it is hard, perhaps, to empathize with Palestinians. And it would be great if I could bring those interviewees back to life in the 30s for me to talk with them why they felt the need to dehumanize Jews and for them to try to understand themselves better, because they didn't make any effort to do that at all.
Thank you, Thomas. I would like to say to this comment that only briefly, not to elaborate about it, that the question of meta-theoretically, psychoanalytically speaking, the question of being empathetic to myself is somewhat, to my mind, contradictory, because I can be empathizing with myself only through a self-object who is empathizing with me. I think it's a contradiction in itself to say that I can be empathizing to myself. What I can do is remember the empathy of my parents, the empathy of my friends, the empathy of Thomas, the empathy of my analysts, and so on. And so I think that meta-theoretically concerning and considering the definition of empathy, we should try in every way that we are using it, really to adhere to what Thomas is recommending, to understand precisely what do we mean in this moment, in that particular context, in the connection to this case and to this event and so on. I would like to say something about the unreputation of the communal, of the collective. And I think that in this I want you, Stephen, to take this challenge as an historian, as a thinker, and as a philosopher. I think that because of so many events, when people are gathering together in order to what I have defined it earlier, to inflate the ego, instead of transcending the ego, then the sense or the notion of collectivism became unreputed, became denigrated in the common and popular thinking. And what I think is that communality may reflect the opposite direction, the opposite process, not of gathering in buttressing ourselves against other, but the process of transcending myself into somebody else and to broaden this bordering more and more. So to my mind, as I said, as a Marxist, not in the old fashion, but in the Buddhist way, that I would like to say, I would like to cultivate the notion of collectivism in the light of self-psychology perspective, in the sense of enlarging and or in diminishing our self-cherishing attitude. Would you like to remark on it?
I have to?
Yeah, you have to.
The only thing I will say is I don't agree that you can't empathize with yourself clearly. Again, I think if you think about at least what my understanding of therapy is, as a patient, say, you can most definitely empathize with yourself as a child. You're not the same person now, but you can look back and understand what your family was like and think yourself back into that experience and understand that, you know, as a child, I engaged in behavior X. I'm still behaving in behavior X today. Behavior X is not really working very well today. It's causing me great suffering. It's causing suffering to people around me. But when I was a child, it made perfect sense that behavior X would be what I would do, given the way my environment was at that time. So I think you can absolutely empathize with yourself. And I guess that's the one comment I wanted to make about self-image. Do we have to run back and forth? I'll hold this. Yeah, don't trip me.
Just two brief comments. I at times, you know, when I wrote this paper, I really was not sure how consistent I was. And first of all, you know, there's this famous anthropologist, Clifford Geertz. Clifford Geertz says that it is completely impossible to empathize with other cultures. That you have to look at their institutions and their symbols, but empathy beyond your own little group is virtually impossible. So what I was saying, you know, some anthropologists would completely disagree with. Secondly, there may be a problem. Thomas, what is the difference between simple reflection and empathy? I reflect on my childhood. I look back in my past. Maybe historians just are reflecting, not empathizing. So I'm making my own case more problematic as well. There is a difference between empathy and what the Germans called verstehen. Even though you try to get into the other, you're reflecting. And then to Raanan, I completely agree with your desire. That is to say that collectives should be about transcending their own borders and moving outwards. But there's a big difference between what the psychoanalyst desires and even what the Marxist desires and the way in which politicians organize their polities. If you have a look at, let's forget Israel for a moment. Very hard to forget, but let's forget it. If you just think about Britain now and America now, it's all about exclusion. It's all about denying collectivity. So maybe the psychoanalyst and the psychologist are on one side and the politicians are on another. And so the problem is, how do you bridge the two?
Just let me respond to the Clifford Geertz. He's wrong too. And what's really nice is I've read all these articles, and I see him actually, Clifford Geertz, like my father, and liked the concept, he liked the experience near that concept. But the article that you're referring to, it's not an empathic article. It's about observing other cultures from the outside and trying to understand the sort of structures and the customs and the habits. But he basically says, you can't think your way inside their world. But there's another philosopher, anthropologists named Peter Winch, and there's a guy named Holen, I can't remember, it's Douglas Holen, I think, who certainly do think you can empathize with other cultures and other peoples. And I think it's really a big mistake to sell the power of human imagination short. I think we have the ability to imagine ourselves in worlds that are very different from our own.
And not forgetting our country and other countries, I think that this is what I meant in the first remarks. I think that this is a role of this convening, to increase and to promote and to cultivate this ideal not as a desire, but as something that can be cultivated in human people. In one of the conversations that Kohut made with his later biographer, Straussier, called The Psychoanalyst and the Historian. It's the first conversation that they had in January 1981, the year of his death. Later on, he was asked by Straussier, is he an optimist or is self-psychology is guilty with optimism or sentimentalism? And you can see how Kohut is refraining from getting to these topics, because he himself in a bit was afraid that this would be the channel where empathy and other notions of him would take the public opinion into. But after all this struggling, he say, well, if this is called optimism, so yes, let it be. So I think it's not a desire. I think it's something which has to do with what we think of what you have mentioned in your lecture. What do we think about human nature these days? And this is a very big topic in psychoanalysis, and I think that self-psychology is kind of a controversial stance to the classical, to the common, and to the phenomenological actuality of so many terrible things that we experience. Self-psychology do believe in infinite potentiality. In this sense, within the psychoanalytic project, I think that self-psychology has a very challenging theory of development, of evolutional development, concerning the ability which doesn't have to occur. We may ruin our nature, we may not use our nature, but it's at our disposal to cultivate something which is transcending this egocentricity. If anybody in the audience want to, please think of something and then...
I'll talk while you're... I mean, I think just so we can go back to something besides Israel, we can talk about Donald Trump, which is always good. But I'm affiliated with the Austin Riggs Center in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, which some of you may have heard of, and they have something there called the Erickson Institute. And we have just started a group in response to the election in the United States. And it seems to me absolutely imperative for Americans and for Americans like me to try to empathize with the people who voted for Donald Trump, and to do it in a way that isn't pathologizing, that isn't using psychoanalytic understanding as a kind of weapon to infantilize, but that what's really important, empathy is required when things don't make sense to us. And I like to think I'm pretty attuned to what goes on in the US. It never dawned on me that he would be elected. I was absolutely flabbergasted and shocked that he was elected. And I think it's really important that we think our way and feel our way and imagine our way inside the various worlds of people who supported Donald Trump and try to understand why it made sense for them to vote for him. And I think that's what if you want to talk about the role of empathy in our world today, it seems to me that's what we should be doing. We should be using empathy not to understand, I mean, the Nazis are an extreme case, but I want to empathize with people I don't, when they do things that don't make sense to me, not the things that do make sense to me.
So if anybody wants to raise something, please don't hesitate.
Thank you both so much for your thoughts. I love hearing parallel and simpatico ideas from different sources. The question for myself as someone who's primarily oriented to the world through Buddhism is, what is curative, to whom, and to what end? Why? You know, to what purpose curative? What purpose relief of suffering? And so, you know, as I'm listening to you both speak such beautiful wisdom, you know, I'm wondering about the role of empathy in relief of suffering. And the role of empathy in the relief of suffering seems very much related to a sense of connection. Either a connection between the analyst and the patient, a connection between the patient and themselves. But then we also see the same relief of suffering in group formations, whether politically or socially, through shared trauma, through shared greed, or through shared ideals. And in this collective space of collective empathy, when you feel with your people, whether in a good way, quote good, or a bad way, quote good, bad, there is a sense of relief of suffering. Yeah, and that sphere can be used for good or evil, and that I agree with you very much. Empathy itself can be like a value-neutral statement. And so then what is the curative factor for me? It has to evolve into this notion of compassion that relies heavily on empathy, but doesn't have to, because it relies almost as heavily on self-awareness. So in order to have compassion for others, you need to have two components. You need self-awareness of what suffering feels like viscerally as an individual. And you also need a sense of freedom is possible viscerally as an individual. And if you've touched your suffering and you've touched your potential for freedom, the degree to which you've touched that within yourself becomes the degree to which you can empathize in both of those factors with others. So it's almost as if you don't need to put yourself in the other person's shoes if you know your own shoes very, very well. You start to see everyone reflected. Everyone is another aspect of yourself. And so it's almost the reverse direction. And so I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
So there were a number of things. You said a lot of really nice things, but sort of try to unpack it a little bit. So I think that's two responses. I mean, I think there's a way this is like, my view of empathy is really sort of technical. And I think that there is definitely, it is very frequently the case that sympathy or compassion, which is my feelings, me belonging to me for someone else, can come as the result of empathy. But they are not, in my technical definition, empathy, because those are my feelings. So, I mean, if you want to go through this in a kind of mechanical way, I can do this as a therapist. I had a brief career. I had a young man in therapy who was a student and announced to me that he was going to leave school and become a fashion model. And when I heard this, he'd said other things, many other things, and on he went, and I didn't. This puzzled me. This didn't make sense to me. This is me looking at him objectively or from outside, and I didn't understand. So then I went inside his space of experience, or inside his world, and tried to understand why it made sense for him to want to become a fashion model. My aim was ultimately to get him not to do this, but I was going to do it through empathizing with him, and then I stepped back out of his world into my own. So I think you're constantly going back and forth, and it's important to be aware that you're never empathizing completely. If you were to do that, it becomes kind of a merger, and that's not a great thing either. You need to be aware as you're empathizing that you are empathizing, and particularly in analysis, I would imagine, you're looking at yourself empathizing while you're doing it, and then you often step out of the empathizing role. So that's the first thing. So empathy as producing, you said something, it was really hurt my feelings, I feel really bad, and then you learn about why that person said it, and it doesn't hurt as much anymore. So I think there is a way that compassion or understanding comes out of empathy, particularly compassion. I guess the only thing about the second thing you said is that there is a worry about if it's self-awareness comes first, that you just project yourself onto people that are different from you. And I think it just, it's a silly thing. It's like, again, we can dump on America. It's like the American invasion of Iraq, where they made no effort to understand the language, the culture, the politics, anything of the country that we were invading. I also didn't think they'd ever do that, but I was wrong there too. But there's a way that they just assumed that they were going to bring democracy to Iraq and everyone would be delighted, whereas there was a way that they needed to get that Iraq is not the United States, that Iraq is a very different place. And again, to get back, Stephen, to what you said before, I think you can really try, and there's a huge difference between trying and not trying to understand something that is very different, a culture, a place, a person that is very different from you. It's really hard to do, but it's better to try than not to try at all and just to assume they're the same as you.
Any other question?
How what is your interpretation concerning the 66 article of Forms and Transformation when Kohut present their empathy as one of the 5 transformations, which for my knowledge or understanding is the opposite of the mechanical way of understanding empathy?
I honestly don't remember that article that well. I mean, what I remember about that article is that I think it's basically the basis for the analysis of the self. My father's work, as far as I had to teach it a couple of times. My favorite piece by far, because I think it's the clearest, is Thoughts on Narcissism and Narcissistic Rage. But I think that article was the basis of the analysis of the self. The way I found, this gets to later in the day, I learned my father's work because he read all his drafts to us. So we had to sit there listening to him read, like, this is what I wrote today, so we had to sit and listen to him read it. So I kind of absorbed all this, and this is why I'm a Kohut, not a Kohutian. Yeah, so again, I just gets back to the earlier point. I think we just need to be clear about how we use empathy, and for me, it's this more technical thing. I think the question, I don't think any of you know, but maybe you do, you're fabulous. How psychotherapy really works, I really don't know. I know my father wrote a book called How Does Analysis Cure? And I know that people in this room have translated this book, and I have read this book, but honestly, it's really hard to know. I think we all know that it works from our own experience, but exactly how it works, and there's also the whole, again, to be historical a bit and empathic, there was this whole anxiety in psychoanalysis during the time that my father was writing about corrective emotional experience. And there was a credible desire to distance oneself from corrective emotional experience. I think psychoanalysis is probably corrective emotional experience. But, and self-development of empathy with oneself. But if you're going to ask me about specific articles of my father, I'm really screwed because
So if we are speaking about father and son, the Kohut and the Kohut, I'm refraining from myself from doing all this gossiping business of relating and so on. I'm very shy about it, but listening to you, to the ways that you are a historian, to the ways that you are writing, to the ways that you are really listening and getting into the depths of the interviewees of yours, I thought, well, I know in which family you was brought. Your in-depth empathy is something which is so organic, so naturally embedded in you, in the ways that you have displayed it. So I would like, in this sense, to read some sentence from quotes in this. Heinz. And if I may, I may? Yeah? Okay. He says in this conversation something that when I say my hierarchy of values, which seems to me axiomatic, is to support human psychological life to its fullest. Then the observer's simultaneous function as a self-object in a supportive one. Now, whether that is optimism, I don't know. We do know that when a child doesn't get mirroring or appropriate responses, it despairs. That sense of bringing hope to others is like the role of oxygen in the atmosphere for us psychologically. It is absolutely needed for psychological survival. So in these few lines of Heinz, I think that we can find the potentiality, the hope, the optimism, the self-objecting functioning, and to me, self-objecting functioning is similar or synonymous to the notion of empathy. Although I know how people can abuse empathy in practice and in definition. That's no doubt of it. Esty, please. Can you shift?
I apologize for my English, but I wanted to say to you that I learned from you something very important in my eyes, that the thought about how society can cure itself. When you say that we have to be empathic to ourselves as a society, so it's not only to demand from us to be empathic, because then we hate the other part of the society that it's not empathic. You suggest to be empathic to the non-empathic parts of the society. And I think it's a very important key to be cured as a society, and I thank you very much for this.
I want to thank you as well for your lecture, and as well the lecture of Stephen Eschheim. It's not very easy for me to talk here because I'm from Germany and I was really very moved. that you don't throw stones to me, to us. And I suddenly started to understand a bit more of my parents. I remembered my mother is now 100 years old and she's still alive. And 10 years ago, she started to be able to talk with me about her being guilty. And the reason was that I brought an Israeli, a Jewish Israeli, to her in her same age. This was a colleague of mine. And she then started to talk about how she all her life could not tell something about what she denied, exactly what you told, what your experience were in the interviews you had. I think she denied and she did not see. She said, I did not believe, I did not see, but of course she knew. And, well, I now understand a bit more because of you now, even a bit more, and I thank you very much for that.
I think we should not say anything more, just to bow. Thank you so much. And we will convene again at 1:15.